Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our Fire Ecology of Oregon webinar series. I'm John Punches, Extension Forester in Northeastern Oregon, and an Associate Professor in the College of Forestry. Very pleased tonight to have with us Dr. Lisa Ellsworth, who's Associate Professor in the College of Ag Sciences. She's going to talk to us tonight about sagebrush ecosystems. Before she jumps into that, let me just remind you kind of how we run these webinars. So, if you have a question that's pertinent to the material that Lisa is presenting, please drop that in the Q&A function in the Q&A box. You'll see the little Q&A thing with a little question mark down in the menu for Zoom. So drop that in there. That's how we handle the questions. We don't unfortunately have the ability to turn your microphones on, so you raising your hands and asking to be recognized isn't going to work for us. So just use the Q&A feature there, and we will be sure to get Lisa to stop periodically and answer questions. We do ask that you keep those questions focused on the ecosystem here that she is particularly talking about. If you have other general comments, things that you want to share, or if Lisa asks you to participate in feedback, do that in the chat box. We've opened that up for folks so you can chat back and forth. I just ask that you keep it professional. Just like make sure that we're not putting stuff in there that isn't appropriate for group sharing. Everybody's been really great over this series, so we really appreciate that. We are recording, and I'll drop a copy of this recording probably tomorrow onto the website for this. And I've asked Lisa to provide us with a handful of references that you all might find interesting, something to follow up on as we move forward. As a reminder, there is the opportunity for those of you who need them to obtain continuing education credits. So if you're in Society of American Foresters, you send the little form that's there on the website to Jake Putney. He's the coordinator of that for our series. And just include the keyword, which I will provide toward the end of tonight's webinar. And then for folks who need credits for Associated Oregon Loggers or the Oregon Certified Burn Manager Program, just send Jake a note telling him that you need that, and he'll get that to you. You are welcome to do this individually each time we do one of these webinars, or you can send it to him at the end of the series and just give a kind of a list there. We have ways to confirm all of that, and we can provide that supporting information to the folks in those different organizations. So with that, I think I've covered all of the basics here, and I'm going to turn it over to Lisa. Lisa, thank you so much for being here, and we look forward to what you have to share with us.
Thank you, John. And thanks to all of you for being on here. I suspect that this has largely been a forestry-focused series, so I really appreciate folks sticking around to hear about sagebrush-dominated ecosystems. So John told you that I am here at OSU. I'm housed in the Department of Fisheries, Wildlife, and Conservation Sciences, and that's in the College of Agricultural Science. So a lot of what I do is working with fire on working landscapes. And so today I'm going to talk about some of the issues that are facing both those ecosystems, but also the people who live and work there. So we'll be talking about fire invasion and some discussion of things that we can do to mitigate those risks in the sagebrush steppe. So I did have one person already chime in and say that they're living in Redmond, so that's sagebrush country. Go ahead and drop in the chat if you want where you're at. I'd love to see where folks are chiming in from. We're talking today about wildfire in sagebrush country, and some of you may be very familiar with Eastside. I didn't know until I started working in sagebrush that 2/3 of the state is actually non-forested, and most of that is sagebrush. Last year was Oregon's biggest wildfire year in terms of the numbers of acres that were burned. There was 1.9 million acres last year. 6 fires were over 100,000 acres, and all of those big fires were in sagebrush rangelands. So while people often think about wildfire as a forest issue, it's also an issue that we're facing in these rangelands. And if we zoom out and think about rangelands broadly, from 1984 to 2020, over 22 million acres of sagebrush have burned. And in about that same amount of time, invasive annual grass, and that's primarily cheatgrass in the areas where I work. Dominance has increased by about 8-fold. So we're seeing these dual pressures of increased fire and increased invasive annual grass. And those are often creating landscapes that look something like the one that's pictured there, where it's just a sea of dry invasive annual grasses. In other places of the sagebrush biome, we're also seeing conifer expansion and infilling, and that often outcompetes the native shrubs that historically would have been the dominant woody species. And so because we have both a change in herbaceous vegetation, and we also have a change in the woody vegetation, you can imagine that fire regimes have been pretty dramatically altered. At the same time, there are people who live and work in these systems and are using it for recreation and are using resources that come from the land. And so things like urbanization, oil and gas industry, the livestock industry, recreation, fuel treatments, things that we do to mitigate risk are also causing increased fragmentation and disturbance. And so if we zoom out a little bit and take a step back in time, we can think about the way that fire has historically shaped the sagebrush biome. Historically, these were shrub and native grassland communities that were maintained by fairly infrequent fire. There was probably a range of fire return intervals, everything from about every 20 years on the more productive end, and as infrequently as 100 years or even more on the driest end. And so that variability is largely shaped by fuel availability. It takes a very long time to grow vegetation in these systems that give very little rain. So on the dry end of the sagebrush steppe, we might only get like 8 to 10 inches of precipitation a year. So it takes a while before the fuel load builds up enough that it's burnable again. And so that's where we had historically those really long fire return intervals. But because of invasive grasses in particular, some of that fuel discontinuity has been broken up, and there's a more consistent fuel bed that fire can burn through. So we can think about a productivity gradient in the sagebrush and how that has shaped fire regimes along two different gradients, both a dry to wet gradient, if you're looking across the bottom of this graph, and from warm to cool as you look up the left side of this graph. And in the driest and warmest areas, which is the most common area across the sagebrush biome, is Wyoming big sagebrush. And they are systems that are very dry, low productivity, probably had historical mean fire return intervals of something like 50 to 100 years or more. As we get a little bit more mesic, a little bit cooler, we have more of our basin big sage communities that had a little bit shorter fire return intervals. On the most productive end at higher elevations, cooler and wetter sites, we have more mountain big sagebrush that had more frequent fire return intervals, probably somewhere on the order of 15 to 50 years. So think about that variability when we're talking about some of these topics that I'll get to. So in the sagebrush biome, the role that fire plays is that it decreases or removes all woody plants, which is both the native shrubs as well as juniper. Juniper is a native tree, but it's also increasing and outcompeting some of the understory species, which is not desirable. Fire also serves to increase dominance of herbaceous plants. The picture that's behind me in my little icon photo shows a lot of native forbs and bunch grasses. This is an area that has recently burned. This is a really good condition area. So places where there's a lot of natives, good condition sites, they actually do pretty well after a wildfire. However, if you have a more degraded site or a site with a lot of annual grasses in the seed bank, you might have a pretty poor condition site dominated by invasives after the wildfire. And so one of the focal points that has brought attention to the sagebrush biome was with the greater sage grouse. The greater sage grouse is a bird that uses lots of different components of the sagebrush biome. It uses pretty flat, open areas for breeding. It uses shrubby areas for its nests. And then when it gets hot and dry, the sage grouse often moves into riparian areas or up in elevation. So we call it a landscape species because it uses all these different habitat components. And that's made it a good focal species for understanding impacts to the entire biome. In the graph that I'm showing here, the lighter color of green is the historical habitat for sage grouse. The brighter green, which is about half of the historical area, is the current range of the greater sage grouse. And so, you can see that it's decreased quite a lot in recent decades, and that's largely due to habitat quality. So, this photo is showing what I would consider to be good condition habitat quality for sage grouse. And this is a really nice area of sagebrush. And the things that I'm looking at in this photo that lead me to think it's in good condition are, I don't know if y'all can see my cursor. We've got some shrubs, both in the background as well as the foreground. We've got some pretty tall, clumpy bunch grasses dispersed throughout the frame. And I also want you to notice that there's a lot of bare ground that you can see. There's a lot of interspace. Those small patches of bare ground or interspace serve as very small scale fuel breaks. So you can imagine that if a fire burned through something like you see in this photo, it might be pretty patchy. Some of the plants might ignite and burn. Maybe the fire spreads to some adjacent plants, but you're not going to lose all of the vegetation if there was to be a wildfire in a site like this. And that's good because it's not just the sage grouse that live there. There's also other native wildlife species that also co-occur in these habitats and have slightly different habitat requirements. For example, on the right there, that's a pronghorn. They do pretty well a lot of times following a burn if there's nice native bunch grasses. Pygmy rabbits also use these sagebrush steppe ecosystems, but they need to be in places with a little bit sandier soil, so slightly different habitat requirements to consider. But these are also areas that are used for oil and gas, like is pictured on the bottom left. And these are working landscapes for the livestock industry as well. So while we're managing these lands for things like sage grouse and some of the other wildlife species that we care about, these are also really important areas for industry. And so this is an example of an area that was burned and then came back almost entirely cheatgrass. This is a worst case scenario and what we really don't want to see out on our rangelands. This doesn't provide habitat for any of the creatures that we talked about, and there's very little natural resource value here as well. This sets us up for a pretty bad situation where we have these threats, where we have too much of a pretty devastating fire. These are many of the spots where we had the very large fires last summer, and many of our range fires that grow quickly typically have a lot of these invasive annual grasses where you've got a continuous field bed. The fire is able to spread pretty quickly. But we've also got areas where we've had too little of the beneficial fire that would have kept things like pinyon pine and juniper here in Oregon out of these systems. So what you're looking at here is an area that historically would have been sagebrush steppe. There has been juniper that has been moving usually downslope and infilling. The juniper outcompete the shrubs initially, and then also the herbaceous plants to where really nothing much grows underneath. So you can imagine that historically, if we would have had regular fire intervals, it would have kept that juniper out. But in places where we've had a reduction in fine fuels, like from grazing, sometimes it's coupled with soil loss and erosion. We've had an increase in juniper in a lot of areas. So there's these dual problems of both too much and too little fire, depending on where you are. So we get to the point where we start to think about what we can do about it. And while there are lots of spots across the sagebrush biome that are really problematic, there are solutions as well. Some of those solutions are things that we can do before the fire starts. Some things that people consider are mechanical treatments. Like the top left photo there, one option is to cut the juniper and leave them on the ground. You might cut the juniper pile and then burn them. Sometimes we do mastication treatments, which leaves like a ropey, kind of a large bark mulch behind. Sometimes prescribed fire can be appropriate in these systems. That's largely dependent on what you have remaining in the understory, the condition of the site prior to the prescribed burn. Managing grazing is always an option. Sometimes that means getting in with animals and removing fine fuels that are flammable after treatment, targeting the cheatgrass without doing damage to the native perennials. You might consider doing an herbicide, which that can be done on large management scales. But it also can be done on small scales with things like backpack sprayers. Sometimes you might consider whether the site has the resources that it needs already, or whether you need to think about planting or seeding your desired resources, which is often your native plants, back onto the site. If the site does burn, you still have options. Again, you might consider whether reseeding or planting bunch grasses and or native shrubs back onto the site would be beneficial. Sometimes folks consider modifying or delaying grazing, using targeted grazing to get at the cheatgrass that we often see in the early years after fire. Herbicide is a good post-fire option. It's usually only effective for a couple of years. But I also want to make sure that folks are considering that an option that's always in our toolboxes is to do nothing. And the photo series on the right there is an area from Heart Mountain National Antelope Refuge where it burned in a wildfire, and for probably 6 years after the wildfire, it looked like it was going to be all cheatgrass. There were several pretty good cheatgrass years, but underneath the natives were still there, and the managers opted to just leave it alone and do nothing. Another couple of years later, it actually looked fantastic. So there is always the option, if you have the resources you need on site to revegetate a site post-fire, you can just leave it alone. So I'm going to take a quick pause, and I'm seeing that there are some things in the Q&A, but John, do you want to?
Yeah. So I'm going to start with this one because it's right on target with what you're just talking about.
Okay,
How does cheatgrass respond to repeated prescribed fire or just repeated fire?
that's a good question. There was probably 20 years ago, a an area of research where people thought maybe we can exhaust the cheatgrass seed bank and we can do repeated burns, like multiple years in a row. And it works. But because they're wind-borne seeds and there's so many of them, you would have to do burning on very large scales. And that's not something that you'd want to do if there's a lot of native resources on site. So while it worked, technically, most of the time it's not really beneficial. That's a really good question, though.
Really challenging question.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it kind of depends, on what your objectives are. Most of the time, fire in cheatgrass is just going to get you more cheatgrass. You might have a year of increased opportunity to do something else after a fire if you want to follow up with something like a native seeding, but fire alone will probably not get rid of cheatgrass.
It is remarkably rewarding to burn, though.
Yeah.
I love the sound of this little popcorny stuff going on, but I just know I'm not really doing anything useful. But
Yeah.
so, Marilyn asks about the comment on having cattle targeting grazing in cheatgrass. She says, do cattle actually like cheatgrass? And if so, like at what stage?
That's a really good question. Cattle really will only preferentially eat cheatgrass when it's young and green and hasn't set seed yet. The seeds are really sharp and pokey. Everyone who's walked around out in these systems knows that. They get stuck in your socks. Cows also don't like to eat them when they've set seed. But early in the growing season, cheatgrass is the first thing that comes up, and it's green before the natives are even up. So there's this window of time when you can target putting animals out there. And I'm seeing a comment in the chat that says John's a bona fide pyro, which I thought I'd share. There's this quick window of opportunity early in the growing season when you can put a number of animals out and target that early season growth and hit the cheatgrass before it sets seed. So that's the goal, is to not let it reproduce. There's also a similar question that I'm seeing in the chat. This is, how do you target grazing? Is it a time of year thing? And yes, some of it's seasonality, some of it's choosing the right animals, whether it's cows or sheep or goats, to really get at the vegetation at the time that you want it removed. So it's usually very short duration. Because usually you want to get the animals out of there, at least out of there in high density, before your native plants are trying to recover.
Great. You have a great photo here that we're looking at right now. So one of the questions is, what does a healthy sagebrush ecosystem look like? And can you like compare it to what an unhealthy sagebrush ecosystem would look
Yeah.
like? And we've talked about the kind of just the grassy stage of unhealthy, but is there a
Yep.
stage at which it's just like over mature and decadent? Is that a real thing?
That's not something that there's like perfect agreement on. You can certainly have sagebrush that is overly dense, such that it starts to outcompete the herbaceous understory. Um, that's good for some things. Like, it's great cover for sage grouse. They will still put nests in that area, but without the understory, it's not great in terms of food resources for sage grouse. It's also not great in terms of post-fire recovery. So, I'm a big fan of managing for heterogeneity on the landscape, which includes some grassy patches, some mid-succession, some late succession sagebrush. I do get concerned when there's really large areas of very late successional sagebrush where we're at the point where we're losing the herbaceous understory.
One of our questions touches on the kind of open areas in the photos that you're showing,
Yeah.
and asks about like, is there a biological crust there? And
Yes.
what's the implications for different treatments and different fire regimes with that biological crust?
Yeah, great question. The biological soil crust can do a couple of really important things. One is that it can hold on to a little bit of extra moisture. And if you're in an area where that only gets 8 to 10 inches of precipitation a year, hanging on to moisture, even just for a little bit longer, can be advantageous to the plants that coexist in that space. The other thing that biological soil crusts do is that they help prevent cheatgrass invasion. So because there's something growing on that soil surface, that site is not available for cheatgrass germination the same way that bare soil would be.
Do you have a sense for how long cheatgrass seeds are viable? Like after they've been set? Are they a 10-year thing, a 20-year thing, a
No,
2-year thing?
it's only a few years. So one individual seed is not all that powerful in terms of the damage that it can do. The problem is that there's so many of them. One plant can put hundreds of seeds out. in a year, and it's hard to exhaust that seed bank. So no, their strategy is to put lots and lots and lots of propagules out, not high quality propagules.
You touched on juniper encroachment.
Yep.
Do you have some thoughts on what factors are leading to juniper encroachment? You gave a couple, like with the change in fire regimes. Is there more to it, or is it just fire?
It's not just fire. It's fire suppression, and it's the seed pressure. I mean, we've gone so far down this increased juniper problem that we have more plants putting out more seeds. So the problem is getting exponentially worse. Um, Part of it too is that because we're using domestic livestock to graze the understory, there's not a lot of fine fuel in some of these areas that can carry a fire through there. So even if we were going to let a fire burn, it's pretty hard to get fire up into the canopy of juniper. That happens under pretty extreme conditions, but there's kind of a rule of thumb that juniper over about 40 years old are pretty hard to burn, and that holds up when you're prescribed burning. There are certainly very high intensity wildfires that can take juniper out, but it's pretty hard to burn an adult juniper. So it's a combination of things.
We have lots more questions. You're stimulating lots of ideas, but I think we need to let you go on for another little bit, and then we'll cycle
Okay.
back to these because my suspicion is you're going to cover some of this stuff. So let's do that.
If there's more ecology questions, this is a great time.
Oh,
I'm
yeah,
gonna
okay.
shift a bit, and I'm gonna talk about a big research project where we test a bunch of fuel treatments.
Okay. Well, there are lots of ecology questions. Do you have any thoughts about like the carbon storage potential in sagebrush environments?
That's a good question. We don't know a lot yet. What we do know is that cheatgrass and other invasive annuals are decreasing the potential for these ecosystems to store carbon. Most of the carbon is stored below ground, and that's from the shedding of roots and decomposition of plant material. And because there's so little moisture in these systems, all that stuff happens really, really slowly. But we do see across the board that when there's cheatgrass, we're losing the capacity to store carbon. We haven't seen a lot of, or I'm not aware of a lot of work that has shown where we can greatly increase the carbon storage capacity. It's more protecting our good condition areas and preventing invasion.
As you progress through your slides, do you anticipate having any photos that show what you would characterize as mid-succession and late succession sagebrush? You kind of mentioned those.
Yeah, I would say that the question that's, or the photo that's up right now, I would call mid-succession. And what I'm looking at to determine that is that there's both shrubs as well as a lot of bunch grasses.
Mhm.
I would call late succession lots of dense shrubs with very little bunch grass. The photo that's behind me in my little photo that you're looking at is all forbs and bunch grasses. And I don't know if you can see there's skeletons that were previously shrubs. So that's very, very early succession.
And these are going to burn differently, obviously. There's different fuel characteristics. So when you get into that dense shrub condition, is the spacing such that if it actually carries fire, is that intense enough that you get high mortality levels? I would think so, but
Yeah,
just
you can.
okay, yeah.
And honestly, you don't even need super high intensity fire to kill sagebrush. Sagebrush is not great with fire. It is killed by fire. It doesn't resprout. It takes a long time to regenerate after fire. The seeds fall pretty much right under the parent plant. So it takes quite a long time for a patch of sagebrush near a fire to propagate and to establish in the fire perimeter. So
Robert asks for a little clarification. You talked about 8 to 10 inches of water. He's assuming that's snow water equivalent. Is that correct?
yeah, and it can be a mix. It can be
Mhm.
one or the other. of snow or rain, or it can be in a lot of cases a mix. So if you're up on the like Columbia Plateau area where we've got sagebrush, there can be years where you don't really get any snow. But if you're up at high elevation, it may be that almost all of the precipitation comes as snow.
Um, Catherine asks if fire intense enough to burn mature juniper has what are the soil impacts from that kind of fire? Is it staying mostly at the surface and in the crowns? Are we getting a lot of soil impacts? Are we killing that biocrust? Are we killing microorganisms in the soil?
It kind of depends what your surface fuel is. If you've got juniper where there's a bunch of duff that has built up, you might have pretty high severity impacts to the soil. Sometimes there's just, pretty sparse grasses underneath, and then it might be a much more mild impact. So, I mean, it depends is not a great answer, but it really depends on what else is there.
What are the fire ignition sources in these systems?
Mostly people.
Mostly people.
Honestly. I mean, lightning starts a good number of fires, but more than half of our ignitions are anthropogenic.
I mean, us foresters have trees, and so we can look at fire scars. Do you have a sense for like what the historic fire what were they was this native and was it indigenous burning? Was it just lightning? What do you think was?
Yeah, lightning in a lot of places. There are also places where there was indigenous burning. It kind of depends where you were. I mean, if it was people that were more river people, they may have burned differently or at different times than people who were trying to move game around, for example. But much less than what you would imagine in like the Ponderosa systems or in the Willamette Valley systems.
Yeah, yeah,
Because people understood very quickly that it takes a long time to grow plants in these very dry ecosystems.
yeah, yeah. You gave an example of the like let it be and let it recover on its own. And Mike is asking, like, what's the typical recovery time for a site if it burns and then is in that kind of grassy stage? And what does it take to get
Yeah.
that was amazing. I would not have believed if you had told me that that site could kind of recover on its own, just
Yeah.
what you showed there. So that's really impressive.
Um, it depends if there's really a huge difference between if you're into like the 8 to 10 inches of precipitation zone or if you're up into like 14 inches of precipitation. If you're on the dry end, decades, like many decades to get your sagebrush back. If you're on the more mesic end, maybe you have 14 inches of precipitation a year, it might be more like 20, 25 where you've got some shrubs coming back. So there's a lot of variability based on the amount of water.
And this is related to my previous question. So Alyssa asks, lacking tree ring data, how were you determining fire return intervals?
So I haven't ever done a study to determine fire return intervals, but I'll tell you what I've read. Um, people have made some assumptions based on dating adjacent trees, especially in the more mesic areas. They butt up against like ponderosa systems, and so people have inferred based on adjacent ecosystems. But people have also inferred based on how long it takes for there to be enough productivity, enough plant material that has come back where it's possible for it to burn again. So that's tied to that last question that we were just talking about how long does it take to recover. There's also some of it that it takes that amount of time for it to be burnable again, because something like the photo that's behind my picture, that's not going to burn again. That's way too sparse. It's going to be a while. Even something like the question break slide, is probably not going to burn very well. It's going to take quite a bit longer before there's enough fuel to sustain a fire.
Um,
Should we do
let's
one
see.
more and move on?
Yeah, so I'm trying to think which one. There's some really good ones in here. Um, in the area where you've been working over there, southeastern Oregon,
Mhm.
there are seasonal wetlands, alkali flats, and those kinds of habitats. What's the interaction between those and sagebrush, and like, do they have commonalities in fire regimes? What's that interaction that might be happening there?
Yeah, I haven't worked much in the alkali flats. If we're talking about places where there's really sparse vegetation, it's probably not going to burn much at all. I'm imagining places, I'm not sure if these are the same areas you're picturing, where there's really just not enough surface fuel to
Yeah.
sustain a fire spread. But if you're talking about some of the more montane wetlands, those can actually be quite productive, and actually do pretty well with fire. Those are some of the places where they're still doing some prescribed burning in especially like wildlife refuges, because they recover quite nicely.
And one more quick one.
Okay.
So sagebrush is a woody plant.
Yes.
Can I like cut it off at some point and count rings and determine the age of an individual sagebrush plant, or is that also and it depends?
That is something that people try to do. Yes, technically yes, but I have never tried to do it. They're very, very tiny rings. I mean, these are plants that might get to 2 inches in diameter when they're 100 years old. So those are pretty tiny rings. Um, I think that the tree lab here has tried to do it a little bit. I think it's frustrating and time consuming and they don't love it. I don't know if you've tried it. I have not.
I haven't, but I have
Technically,
counted
yes.
200 rings in an inch, um, in a 1 inch diameter tree. Because
Yeah.
we get some trees that are just like they have those same slow growth rates. So I also think that
But
I just wonder if in many cases with sagebrush, there's probably a lot of missing rings that would be hard to identify. That like there's just some years
well,
where they don't really do much. So
that's true, but also fire kills sagebrush. So we're not going to reconstruct a fire history because one fire in
right,
sagebrush is
yeah,
done. It really does not do well with fire at all,
right.
even if it's just scorched.
Yeah, this
It
was
will
just
usually die.
this question was just about can we age the
Yeah.
individual sagebrush? So, all right,
Yeah.
I'm gonna let you forge ahead.
Okay.
This has all been super
Let's,
interesting, and thank you for taking all that time to
yeah,
answer.
we'll do it again. All right. So I'm going to move past this background ecology section. And I'm going to talk about a research project that I've been involved with for quite a while. It's called the Sagebrush Step Treatment Evaluation Project, and we call it SageStep for short. It's a project that I'm leading with Beth Newingham at the Agricultural Research Service and Dustin Smith at the Bureau of Land Management. And we're testing some of these different options for mitigating fuel and fire risk across large landscapes. I'll also point out that this is a partnership. These sites are all across the Great Basin, and there's folks from universities, there's folks from federal agencies, state agencies, nonprofits who are all involved. So this is a giant collaborative project, lots and lots of partners. Lots of those folks, their agencies' icons are pictured here, but it's a lot of really wonderful people who have contributed. So the experimental design of SageStep is that there's two networks. There's a shrubland network, which is places where sagebrush is dominant, and there's problems with cheatgrass in the understory. Those sites are pictured on the map in the orange icons. So here in Oregon, we've got a couple of them at Heart Mountain, both the Rock Creek and the Great Butte site. The woodland network, these are places where shrubs have been outcompeted by Western juniper in Oregon. Those are denoted with the green icons. So in Oregon, we have Bridge Creek, which is up by Mitchell. Walker Butte is near Christmas Valley. Divine Ridge is by Burns. Five Creeks is out towards Beatty's Butte area. And then we've got more sites in California, in Nevada, in Idaho, and in Utah. So there's in total 19 sites across the Intermountain West, and we've been measuring them for 18. We've got 18 years of data. We're going into our 19th field season this year. So at this point, we've got this really long time series of pre-treatment and post-treatment data. The treatments in the shrubland plots are prescribed fire, mowing of the sagebrush, and herbicide that targets sagebrush to thin. We talked about that late succession. The herbicide targets thinning the canopy and encouraging growth of the herbaceous understory. In the woodland network, we also have prescribed fire plots. We have mechanical tree removal, and we have mastication, which again, like chops up the trees and creates like this ropey bark mulch. And then we measured lots of different things following treatment and in untreated controls. We're at year 19 now. So we've looked at soil variables like soil temperature and soil water. We've looked at erosion, both wind erosion and water erosion. We've looked at runoff in the different treatments. We've got microclimate stations at every site where we get temperature, both minimum and maximum every day. We get precipitation, both rain and snow. We're looking at different vegetation characteristics. So we measure all of the plants by species that are out there every year. So we're tracking native and invasion dynamics. We're looking at habitat for various wildlife species. I've got a grad student right now that's looking at it from a songbird perspective. We've got folks who have done insect work out there. What my lab mostly does is fuels and fire behavior work. So we do a lot of fire behavior modeling to see if these treatments are gaining us any ground from a fire risk perspective. And then we've had people do human dimensions work, both social science as well as the economics of different treatment options. And so at this point, it's the longest running and largest replicated field treatment experiment that we're aware of. And that's given us this rich long-term data set that lets us learn about things like the slow growing species that we have in these ecosystems, about above and below ground carbon storage and loss, invasion dynamics, trophic effects, the way that all these different ecosystems respond after wildfire. And so some of the punchlines from the first 10 years of data collection and analysis in the shrubland network. So again, these are places where we have shrubs, some amount of cheatgrass in the understory. Cheatgrass is increasing across the whole network in both the treatment and control plots. So it's not that the treatments are making it worse, it's that cheatgrass is increasing everywhere. So we think that that's at least partially a climate signature. Sagebrush recovery is slow on that dry end. Some of our plots we're not really seeing cheatgrass coming in very well, or not seeing sagebrush come in very well after treatments at all. The woodland plots, there's more moisture availability. The treatments had more negative effects, and that usually means more invasive annuals, again, in the driest sites. When we removed the tree canopy, we do get more herbaceous vegetation. And if that herbaceous vegetation is native, that's a really good thing from a restoration perspective, or from a wildlife habitat perspective, but it also means that there's increased surface fuels and increased fire risk. So we took all this vegetation data and built fuel models and ran predictive fire behavior models. And we found that in the shrublands, the mechanical treatments and the prescribed fire treatments did reduce fire behavior. But in the woodlands, it actually increased fire behavior because we were either dropping those juniper canopies on the ground, and we were also encouraging the restoration of the understory. So because we had all that additional surface fuel, there was actually increased wildfire risk. We also had some big surprises. 40% of our sites burned in the first 12 years, which, you know, at first was thought of as a terrible loss. But then we realized that what it really means is that we have the opportunity to see what happens when all these different treatments burned. And so that's what a lot of our focus has been the last few years, to see, like, did we gain anything by doing these treatments prior to wildfire such that the post-wildfire recovery is better. We've seen definitely a change in climate. We've seen an increased mean annual temperature across the network. Invasive species have increased across both controls and treated plots. We're seeing significant soil loss. That's mostly wind erosion. And then we've collected some really cool data on some, especially bird species at risk, including sage grouse and pinyon jay. This picture on the bottom right is a one example of some acoustic recording devices that we put out that actually listens for various wildlife, mostly bird songs. And then there's also towards the bottom of that station some camera traps. So we're actually, getting a feel for what wildlife are using, which sites and which treatments within sites. So there's been some cool stuff. So we're gonna do some looking as a group at some different sites and assessing like what are the risk factors on this site? What are the values we see on this site? So I look at this one, for example, and I see pretty good condition shrubs. So somebody asked earlier about late succession sagebrush. This would be an example of that. I do still see in the in-between space, there's still some space where herbaceous plants are growing, but there's pretty dense shrubs. The bigger problem that I see is that we have an increase in juniper. Both, there's some individuals that are in the foreground, but also a whole bunch of them in the background. So I look at that site, and my number one concern is that the juniper problem doesn't get worse. I look at this photo. This is a pretty constant sea of invasive annuals. But the resources that are most important to me on this site are these islands of sagebrush. So I want to protect those little clumps of sagebrush as my first priority. So that might mean that I would go in and do some treatment on the invasive annuals, maybe something like spraying some herbicide, probably follow up with some seeding treatments. This might be an area that's a good candidate for targeted grazing in the spring. But the treatments that we would do to remove cheatgrass, most of the time would be considered step one, where step two needs to be getting native plants back out on the site. So that probably needs to be done with seeding. So I'm going to take another few minutes to answer a couple questions, and then we're going to go through some more of these scenarios together. And I want you all to think through, what are the resources available on this site? What might we do there? But I'll take some more questions first.
Yeah, so you've mentioned herbicide use. Are there some specific ones?
Yeah, if we're talking about suppressing cheatgrass, imazapic is used the most often. Plateau is the trade name. It's fairly effective. You want to do it pretty early when, again, when cheatgrass is up, but before the natives are up. It works for about 2 years, and then you have to think about retreating. So it's not a long-term solution. It's something where you either want to treat and then seed, or you want to treat and then treat again in a couple of years and treat again in a couple of years and give the natives a chance to recover. Indazaphylam is another one that is still mostly experimental, but people think that it might end up being a better option than imazapic. Not sure yet.
And are those pretty well targeted to the annuals and
Yeah.
safer around the perennials? Is that what you're trying to do there?
Um, yes, that is the goal. There are some studies that have shown some non-target impacts to natives, but people generally think that the benefits outweigh the
Gotcha.
risks.
Yeah. So something like glyphosate, which is more general in application, that's
Yeah,
probably
we wouldn't use that.
yeah. Because
No, we'll use, and if there are places where if the sagebrush canopy is overly dense and thinning it is a consideration. There was, a couple decades ago and kind of in some pockets, people still use a lot of tebuthyron, which targets the woody vegetation. And you can use it in a kind of a patchy application, so you can thin the sagebrush canopy.
you have mentioned some um, mastication that's being done in the juniper areas.
Yeah,
When you masticate, does that, I mean, that's going to knock those adults down.
yeah.
Is there enough of a seed bank that builds up? Do you have a reseeding issue from that or not so much?
Yes. You don't have a reseeding issue from the mastication. You have a reseeding issue because birds love juniper berries and spread them
Mm,
everywhere. And also
yeah.
juniper often are on hill slopes and juniper berries are perfectly round. So they spread really, really well.
They just
You know,
roll
they
downhill.
roll
Yeah.
downhill and birds spread them around. So mastication doesn't seem to increase that problem.
So you mentioned doing things that encourage heterogeneity.
Yeah.
So Isabel asks, can you do that with prescribed fire? Can you do prescribed fire in a way that encourages heterogeneity, or does it kind of make it more uniform?
There is not perfect agreement on that. And I think it depends a little bit on what the um, condition of your site is like before you consider prescribed burning. If you have a good condition site, I would say yes. I am a fan of doing light prescribed burning and patchy burn to punch some holes in that canopy. Um, there's just been so much risk with fire and sagebrush that a lot
Yeah.
of folks don't want to do that. So part of it's the social acceptability and the risk that individual managers might be taking by doing that. Ecologically, yes, it can be beneficial.
If you use the mastication in sagebrush, does that tend to kill the sagebrush, or will they resprout?
Sagebrush don't resprout. I'm not sure that I've ever seen mastication done in sagebrush. That's more something that's done to treat juniper, to my knowledge.
I've only seen it like along fuel breaks
Yeah, that's
in that
true.
kind of
That's
context.
true.
So,
But mostly we just mow it. Like literally they take like a rotary deck mower and chop it off to about, half of the height. And as long as you leave about 50% of the height of the plant, they'll usually survive. So that's actually a pretty good strategy for
mm,
fuel breaks or for thinning the canopy without needing to pulverize it. And then you
yeah.
have, like the top half of the canopy is downed wood on the soil surface.
Mhm.
Um, but that can reduce fire risk some too.
So Alyssa asked an interesting question, just kind of a thought process here. If we're like thinking about trying to protect that sagebrush island that you've talked about, could you put a bare mineral soil line around it, do an early spring burn in the cheatgrass? Would the timing work? What do you think about the overall prospects of something like that working?
Yeah. Um, I would be pretty cautious with burning around, you're protecting these little babies. I would be more inclined to do some herbicide or some targeted grazing to try to get that fuel load down, and then follow up with like reseeding. If it didn't look like there was a lot of
Yeah.
native resources on site, so you probably need to get some back out there. Um, doing a small scale fuel break. If that's the only thing you have to protect and you have the people power to get out there and do something like that, I think that could be a really good option. If you have, 100,000 acres that you're treating, you probably can't build a small field break around every clump. So you might consider broader scale applications like herbicide. It could just get you there faster.
And isn't it true also that like any of our attempts to burn in cheatgrass, part of the problem is that we can't burn a big enough we can't get rid of enough cheatgrass to not have a nearby source of cheatgrass that's gonna be the vector to
Yeah.
bring it back in. So
Yeah. Yeah, like cheatgrass burns, and that's great. You can get rid of it for now, but you're not done dealing with the problem because you're gonna
yeah.
get more next year and more the next year. So, if that's one of the tools that you have available to you, you probably want to be thinking about what's next because you don't want to just burn cheatgrass every year.
Yeah, and part of the challenge that I think you've mentioned this before is that any of these burning operations, as much as we'd like them to work, there's just that potential for more cheatgrass, or in some areas, if we kill off the juniper without, excuse me, kill off the sagebrush without killing off the juniper, we just end up with more juniper. So either of those are potential.
Yeah, yeah. There's a comment that came in the chat that is a really good one that I want to point out. Um, um, Leslie talks about the importance of the successional trajectory. And sometimes the management strategy is to do things like plant late successional species like sagebrush and then be super surprised when it didn't work. Whereas, when you actually like move through succession, you do get the annual grasses and forbs first. You do have resprouting perennials. And so to use that to your advantage to understand succession and to plant some of those earlier successional species first, but desirable native ones. And as the system starts to recover, maybe consider planting some of the later successional species at the more appropriate time in that successional trajectory. We don't like to wait though. We like to do things, right? And so people often do seeding or planting, as you've suggested, fairly early in the game, and it doesn't always work super well.
Yeah, and then Mike he just wonders if you would share your perspective on juniper removal prescriptions. Do you, if you're going to remove some, do you remove it all? Do you leave some? Do you leave the big old trees? What do you think?
Yeah, yeah, that's a really good question. Juniper is a native tree and it's got a lot of ecological value. It's got a lot of cultural value. And so those historical woodlands are, we're realizing that we shouldn't just be applying juniper treatments everywhere uniformly, but some of those places where juniper have been growing for hundreds of years are probably pretty scabby areas. Sometimes they're rocky outcroppings, places that were protected from fire because there wasn't anything in the understory to carry fire. So those are probably not areas that we want to remove juniper in. It's really easy to distinguish the difference between old growth juniper and young juniper. The young juniper look like Christmas trees. They have pointy tops. They're pretty soft and green. The historical woodlands start to round off, so they become pretty gnarly looking. The bark gets really ropey and they become, lots of strange, interesting bonsai type shapes. So usually when we're removing juniper, we're targeting the Christmas tree shapes, the encroachment woodlands, sometimes people call them. And more understanding the ecological value and the cultural value of the historical woodlands and leaving those alone.
In some of our other presentations, we've had speakers who've talked about, indigenous use of some of these different plant species there. Are there
Yeah.
indigenous uses of sagebrush?
Um, Yes, there are indigenous uses of many of the plants in the sagebrush biome, and I don't have a full understanding of all of those. I have talked to a couple folks from tribal groups about separating out the plants that they consider to be most important. Usually they're first foods. Um, and looking to see what the treatment impacts specifically on those plants are, but we haven't done that yet. But yes, there are many culturally valuable plants. The lomatiums are one that has come up quite a few times as being important. Pinyon pine on the east side of the network is another one where the pine nuts are a culturally valuable food source.
So are there feral horses down in these areas, or what's the impact of feral horses?
They're pretty problematic in some areas. They like to be close to water and they can decimate an area pretty quickly. Yeah, they can be quite problematic. They're patchy in distribution, so their impacts are not uniform. But they can be extremely destructive.
So in some of the ways that we identify potential fire regimes, particularly historic regimes, is to look at lake bed sediments. Are there
Mhm.
equivalents of that in these kind of sagebrush steppe areas?
Yeah, people have done that to date different areas to try to reconstruct what the fire return intervals might have been. I haven't been involved in any of that work, so I can't tell you, specifically where. I am aware that that's one line of evidence, so when we're trying to figure out like what is the historical return interval, we bring in multiple lines of evidence. Like what are the adjacent trees dating to? What are the
Mhm.
lake beds tell us? What does fuel accumulation and reburn potential tell us about reburn? But that's not something that I've personally been involved with.
Yeah. So AIM commented that he thinks that Western juniper might be allelopathic. So in other words, it exudes chemicals or things that
Yeah.
do you know of that for a fact? I've always commented on that because that's certainly been my
Yeah.
observation.
So yes, it's thought to be at least weakly allelopathic, which means that a lot of things won't grow underneath the juniper. I don't know how much of it is chemical, and I don't know how much of it is the fact that it dumps a lot of litter underneath. And so it also like
Yeah.
removes some of the safe sites where something might germinate. I actually just saw some data today though that perplexed me, where somebody looked at juniper that's over low sage communities, and there's almost nothing under juniper, but the Idaho fescue does awesome under juniper. So there's definitely some chemical relationship where the Idaho fescue is more tolerant of the allelopathy, or maybe it's utilizing the increased shading and moisture under the juniper. I don't know why, but yes, I have heard repeatedly that juniper is at least mildly allelopathic.
Yeah, that's certainly been my observation. And from doing prescribed fire in areas where there's a significant juniper component, usually those older junipers, I've started to talk about juniper forming its own defensible space because there's that area
Yeah.
underneath them that just like fire will walk right up to them and then stop. And it's just like or it
Some of it
smolders
too,
through.
yeah. Some
So,
of it too is that juniper uses all of the water. So some of it's that it's taking up all of the resources available on the site and just out competing things.
okay. So, who pays for these restoration treatments on public lands? Is there a big effort to do sagebrush step restoration, or is it more like from a scientific perspective at this point?
There's some restoration that's done at a management scale. Um, I see the most done around wildlife habitat values, protecting threatened and endangered species. It's more that people are trying to manage with low cost options. Like often that means herbicide. Like seeding programs and outplanting programs are very expensive. So those are done far less often. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
One
So
last
we're
question.
yeah,
Oh, sorry. One
go
last
ahead.
question. You've mentioned a couple times now about potential for reseeding in some of these areas, post-fire, post-treatment. Where does one go to find the appropriate native seeds and clean seed for these kinds of treatments?
Yeah, that's a good question. There are commercial places where people are doing good and better and not so good jobs at getting appropriate seed materials. There are some very good native seed sources. There are some very good tribal nurseries in Oregon that are providing some plant materials. So there's a variety of choices that people make. People don't always choose to use native seeds either. I haven't talked about it much, but some people use plant materials that grow quickly and provide good forage, but aren't necessarily native. So that's also an option. That's, one of your tools. That they can outcompete the natives. They don't do great with natives, but they're excellent forage. They're excellent soil stabilizers. So there's always trade-offs to consider.
All right, we're going to let you proceed on. I know you've got
Yep, I'm
more.
going to move into some scenarios where I'm going to ask y'all to participate. So I'm going to go through a few photos, and I'm going to ask you to drop your answers in the chat. The first question that I'll ask you about each of these sites is, what concerns do you have about the site? And the second question I'll ask her, what are some management actions that you might consider taking on a site like this? So this is your first site. First, if you could chime in on what concerns do you have? I see someone said, please don't reseed with crested wheatgrass. Yes, that is a repeated issue that some folks very much don't want to reseed with non-native plants because it can outcompete the natives and you will never get it back to purely native composition. So people are saying they're seeing lots of invasive annual grasses. They're seeing some juniper in the background, lots of annuals. People are saying the sagebrush looks small and maybe struggling. Some of the sagebrush seems to be advanced in age. So yeah, I see those too. I'm concerned about the continuity of fuels due to the invasive annual grasses in particular. But there is quite a bit of native value to the site, right? Because you are also all bringing up the fact that we do still have sagebrush there. Some of it doesn't look so great, but that the understory looks super flammable. So what are some things that you might consider, remembering that every time I ask you to consider management options, one of your options is always not treat. So what would you do? Somebody says targeted grazing or herbicide. Yeah, those are good options. Cattle, someone said prescribed burning. I would be concerned about losing the sagebrush in a prescribed burn. Someone else said no grazing, maybe let it recover from too much grazing. So there's all these things to consider. And one thing that's always important is that grazing is lots of different things. So the timing, the intensity, the type of animal used are all pieces of the puzzle to consider. But you are getting at that we want to do something about the invasive annuals, but we also want to notice the juniper that are coming in. There's just a few in the background of this photo, but we don't want them to increase in number. Somebody said depends on objectives, and I'm glad you said that, right? We have different reasons for doing treatments. If you're targeting getting the sagebrush to recover, maybe this is important sage grouse area. You're trying to get the invasive annuals out at all costs. If you don't have cultural plants on site, maybe you're considering revegetating with some of those. Yeah, the objectives are super important. How about this one? What do you see in this photo? Yeah, somebody says there's quite a bit of bare soil. There's a lot of natives. Yeah, good. I see those things too in the foreground. Early successional. Yeah, this is an area that actually had burned just a couple of years before this. But only the foreground, like 2/3 of the photo burned. Also notice that that back third didn't burn, and there's still sagebrush. So you've got both good recovery of the herbaceous vegetation, but you have a good seed source for the sage to come back to. Somebody said juniper in the background. Yeah, you always want to take note of and treat if you have juniper coming in. Somebody said there's a patchy structure. Aren't bare spots normal? Yes, I actually really like that I can see some interspace here in this early successional area. So what are some management actions you might consider in an area like this? Somebody said it's recovering. Thanks, Jason. Isabel says leave it alone. I agree. I completely agree that this is one of those spots where you don't need to do anything. It's recovering well from disturbance. We've got good native composition on the site, and we have the propagular pressure from the sagebrush where it's likely to revegetate on its own. Elisa brought up actively monitor for invasives. I completely agree. Have your weed crews take a look. This might be something as simple as, having backpack sprayers available. You don't need to do broad scale herbicide treatment in something like this. So, oops. All right, let's go to the next one. This is number 3. What do we got here? So this is a site that's got some fairly dense sagebrush. Somebody suggested potentially seeding here. This might be a candidate area for punching some holes in, either with some mowing treatments or maybe a little prescribed burning. We do still have pretty good perennial understory. You can see the bunch grasses that are coming in underneath. Yeah, somebody said it's thinning old sage, keep some for seed recruitment. You're definitely going to want to leave a good bit of it for wildlife. Yeah, so this is a spot where we might not treat yet because we're protecting shrub cover, but at some point we want to think about what's the broader landscape heterogeneity. What is this patch of dense sage sitting amongst? If it's sitting amongst a lot more dense sage, I'm a lot more concerned about that than if it's adjacent to maybe some earlier successional sage. Somebody said protect it from wildfire. Yeah, I don't think this is going to do great if it burns. There's not a rich understory. I can see some perennial bunch grasses, but not a lot of forbs. What about any management actions? Are we just going to protect it, leave it alone? Anything else we want to do? I would say this is another one where just monitoring for invasive grasses, but maybe not doing a lot of active stuff is necessary. All right, let's go to number 4. What concerns do you see here? I really don't like the look of the juniper. And a lot of you are chiming in about the same thing. The sagebrush itself looks great. This is a pretty high elevation site where it looks like it's probably a mix of sagebrush and bitterbrush. But it looks pretty fantastic except for those juniper moving in. So my number 1 priority for management action is doing something about the juniper. What would you all consider doing with the juniper? Mulching it, maybe mastication. Somebody said chainsaw, knocking them down, cut, pile, and burn. Yeah, lop and scatter. Depends, but depends on what. I'm not seeing any advocates for prescribed burning. I wonder if anyone would consider burning this.
I'm not sure how I could even, I'd like to burn it, but I'm pretty sure I couldn't burn it and kill juniper without taking out that really beautiful sagebrush and bitterbrush.
Yeah, I would want to be really cautious with fire, but this is a really productive site because I can see bitterbrush in there. This is more like a 20-year fire return interval. So I think this site actually would recover okay from a little bit of prescribed fire. But your number 1 priority, I agree with what everyone is saying, is get that juniper out of there. All right, one more. What concerns do you have about this site? It looks cold. I don't like that either. No sagebrush. Yeah, that's my biggest concern too. We have big juniper that's going to be very hard to kill. This is actually a site that burned in a wildfire, and some of the juniper were killed, but mostly they were not killed. There's no sagebrush, and we have some native herbaceous plants coming back. And there's also some invasive annuals. And it's not just that there's no sagebrush in the foreground, but you can't see any sagebrush in that entire picture. So that's very concerning to me too. This is one of the sites that's some of our worst condition problems where we're dealing with both juniper and invasive annual grass. And that's when treatment becomes limited. This might be an area where you decide because resources are limited. I don't know if this is a place that we would treat. It happens to be that this is on a state wildlife refuge that's really important wintering habitat for mule deer. And so the managers have chosen that they are going to invest heavily in this site. And so they're doing layered treatments of removing juniper, invasive annual grasses, reseeding, replanting, to try to recover this site because it's an important mule deer corridor. But but I can absolutely see the opinion that this is maybe not where I'd invest my resources. So what I want to bring up again, and somebody brought it up in the chat, is that all those photos I showed you are close up, but they also all have this landscape context. And we're really talking about all of those different situations and types of ecosystems that are juxtaposed, very near each other. We're talking about the socioeconomics of different land uses that lots of folks value. We're talking about threatened and endangered species. We're talking about all these things in the same types of landscapes. So we have to consider not just the individual site, but that broader picture. And then somebody else brought this up, that success really depends on what you're going for. What were your treatment objectives? Are you trying to restore native diversity? Are you trying to remove encroaching conifers? Is the goal wildfire risk reduction? Is the goal to prevent invasive annuals? Are we trying to increase forage quality or quantity, to protect wildlife habitat, to increase heterogeneity? And then we have to consider that sometimes there's trade-offs. When we're managing for one of these things, we might be giving up something else. For example, these are some photo series from some restoration plots at year 0 pre-treatment, year 1 just after treatment, and then 10 years later. The top third is prescribed burn, the middle third is mechanical treatment, and the bottom is untreated control. And so what I want you to see is in the prescribed burn, in year 1, we lost all of the sagebrush. We have pretty good native recovery right after the fire, but if you look out to year 10, there's quite a lot of invasive annuals there. So while, restoring the herbaceous understory initially may have met some of those goals, longer term, it actually didn't look great. In the mechanical treatment, the goal was to remove encroaching juniper. That second photo in the year 1, there's a lot of dry woody fuel on the soil surface, and from a fire risk perspective, that's quite concerning. From a juniper reduction perspective, that was a success. The untreated controls, from a fire risk perspective, those actually don't look burnable. But there's still a lot of undesirable juniper in the overstory. So, one of you brought it up that while we may be treating to accomplish one objective, we may be inadvertently, causing some other issues. So to think through those objectives pretty carefully in considering the options. And so with that, I'll say thank you. And I think I'm supposed to give a plug for next year. Or next week. I'll let
Next
John
week.
give a plug, and then
Yeah.
maybe we'll have some more time to chat.
Yeah, so next week we're going to talk about oak savanna and oak woodlands with Stacy Siminook. So that I think that'll be really fun to kind of get that perspective. There's, we have oak, savanna, and woodlands. We think of that as maybe like Willamette Valley, Umpqua Valley, down in the Rogue Valley, but it's also an east side thing because we've got oak and pine savannas that are really prevalent up in the Hood River area. So I think it'll be really interesting to get some ideas about how the ecology of those ecosystems is functioning relative to fire. So that's coming up. We do have a couple of questions if you are willing to
Cool.
answer a couple more.
Yeah.
So do sagebrush plants transplant well? Can I move them around?
They have really deep roots. Once I thought it would be a really good idea to get some tiny little sagebrush and try to bring them home with me. I live in the Willamette Valley, and bonsai them, and they all died. Very deep roots. So start with young ones. Nursery stock seems to do pretty well because it was grown in a medium where it's easier to move the roots. My experience with trying it was that it didn't go so great, but they use it in native plant restoration. So I think I probably just did it poorly by trying to get native ones that were doing very well in their native soil.
Marilyn asked if you could recommend any research papers on carbon and sagebrush step. We talked about that briefly earlier. So
Yeah. I will put that. I will look and I will put a couple, I'll send a couple to John that he can put in the resources that he makes available to you. There are a couple recent ones that have come out, but I need to look at them to make sure I'm telling you the right one.
awesome.
Oh,
Thank you.
somebody said they had much better survival than I did. I mean, maybe I should have just not tried to do them in bonsai pots or in the Willamette Valley. Like, I don't live in the right ecosystem for sagebrush.
Makes me wonder if with sagebrush, do you need a green thumb or more like a gray thumb? So
Probably gray.
gray thumb, maybe that's what it is. Yeah. So I'm just like one final one here. So one of the characteristics that I find so intriguing about sagebrush steppe is all of that presumably bare space in between, but it's like if it's well developed, it's not bare, it's a biological crust, right? So what do you know about those biological crusts and like how long do they take to form and what's the recovery period for those relative to some of the treatments that we attempt?
Yeah, that's a good question. Extremely variable. So the biological soil crusts are a mix of mosses and lichens. And I did a greenhouse experiment where I just scraped up some of the biological soil crust from the field and sprinkled it in the greenhouse plots. And the mosses grew in a very short period of time, like a few weeks. Some of the lichens there, there's a whole successional trajectory with the biological soil crusts too. So it really depends which components you're talking about. You can get a crust of mosses in a very short amount of time, but you wouldn't have a diverse assemblage like you see in the field for much longer.
Awesome. Thank you. And for those of you hanging out to get the SAF keyword for tonight's presentation, it is surprisingly sagebrush.
Sage.
Sagebrush. Yeah. So yeah, so Lisa, thank you so much. This has been
Yeah,
awesome. I love the conversational style and all the opportunity to ask questions. It's just
yeah.
been awesome. Great pictures. Lots of compliments coming in here through the chat box. Everybody, thank you for participating. We really appreciate that, and we'll look forward to hopefully seeing you again next Thursday. For this is Stacy's gonna kind of bat clean up here and give us the last in the series. This has been fun. It's been really fun to dig into the ecological concepts around fire interacting in these different systems. And it's really clear that like we need like 50 more of these because there's so much more to talk about. So Lisa, we'll have you back. Thank you so much. And
Well, thanks,
thank you
John.
for all
Thanks,
the great
y'all.
work that you're doing. Just really appreciate it.